Hello, friends and star pals. This is Lindsay Turner and Sarah Knoll with our February 2025 month ahead forecast. Welcome, Sarah. Good to see you.
You too.
Things have been, it's been a rough month. January, we're recording this with about a week left in January, and it's been a real month. So just a little agenda for today. We're going to review January's astrology and events that happened and just kind of, talk about the fires and the inauguration. And then we'll look ahead to February's astrology and what kind of energy we're anticipating working with and what kind of events we might be seeing in our own personal lives and in the world. And then we'll finish with some spiritual grounding. We're going to take a look at the Gospel of Mark at a passage that I think could really speak to ways to ground in this moment. Just checking in, Sarah. How are you doing?
It's kind of rough in Houston. We had a snowstorm and uh, I work at a hospital, so that put the hospital in a disaster kind of protocol. Right at the same time that the new administration started signing a million executive orders that really impact healthcare and immigration and LGBTQ issues, all of which are at the heart of the work that I do. So it's been pretty rough. It's been so rough that when I do have a moment and I think to myself, what did we say January was going to be like? I literally cannot remember. So I don't
Yeah.
remember if we thought there were certain parts of January that would be a reprieve, but I have not felt any reprieve in January. So it makes me want to go back and see what I need to learn about what we predicted versus what is happening. What about for you?
Um, yeah, I think term hot mess was used. Well, we had talked about this, the Mars retrograde, and the month beginning with that Mars retrograde opposite Pluto, that second of three passes as being
Yeah.
um, quite defining of January's astrology. And then, around inauguration, we had the Venus Saturn conjunction just days before the Pluto Sun conjunction, which was about the day of inauguration. And I had friends texting me, "What is going on right now?
Mhm.
There is some really heavy stuff happening." And that's what I choose to correlate the world weather with the astro weather. Um, is yeah, those two, the Venus Saturn and the Sun Pluto, and mid January. So, um, pretty rough times, very dramatic. Um, very, terrifying, but also I'm finding things to be very inane, right? Like, what this this is really stupid. What
Mhm.
is happening is so unnecessary yeah, it's difficult for me to really orient to it any other way as, like, scary, but also really stupid. Like, really.
Mhm.
And of course, we had, in addition to the inauguration, and all these executive orders that are coming down and reversing all sorts of civil rights, we also had a really tragic a series of fires in LA that are still ongoing. Yeah, I just think that that's been a really huge event in the US. And I also noticed, like, Justin Trudeau resigned, when Mars, retrograde moved into Cancer. Those fires started when Mars retrograde was that first degree of ingress back into Cancer, the aneretic degree of Cancer, which we've noticed when Mars is at 29 degrees of a sign, that often is like the when the shit hits the fan moment astrologically. Um, we had talked a little bit about that maybe last week or 2 weeks ago when we met Sarah about, the January 6th insurrection, I believe happened when Mars was aneretic at the final degree of maybe Taurus. Does that sound right to you?
Sounds right. I'm thinking how I haven't really thought about aneretic degrees in a retrograde process. So a
Mhm.
planet is passing back and forth through that same degree as a part of retrograde. That's kind of an interesting thing to think.
Yeah, yeah, totally, and on a personal note, when the night, because it happened in the middle of the night for me, it was like around like 3:30 in the morning when Mars went back into Cancer. I was up. I had either like, I mean, I had poisoned myself. I don't think it was like a food poisoning, but I had like eaten something that I shouldn't have eaten. Like I got some gluten or something accidentally, and yeah, I was up during the ingress, with stomach issues, and I thought,
Mm.
"God, that is, it's just too perfect," and I had posted about it, and a lot of people were like, "Yeah, I was up with stomach issues last night too," or like, "Yeah, my stomach is really bothering me, the last couple of days," and so, yeah, I think that was a really interesting, and not fun expression of Mars retrograde going back into Cancer.
Mhm. I think we had talked about, like, discovering through some of this Mars retrograde transit, and I think maybe if we feel like touching on the Cancer full moon, because I'm tracing a lot of things to the Cancer full moon, um, very close, like, so close with Mars, co-present with
Mhm.
Mars,
Yeah.
that sometimes when I know there's, like, a Moon Mars thing happening, I'm extra, extra careful because of my own stomach issues and my own natal signature in terms of Moon Mars. But that something will inevitably happen that messes with my most carefully laid plans. So, like, there's a place I go in the
Mhm.
hospital to get my tea every single time I'm in that part of my routine. And, they just didn't have it that day. So it was like, do you want to fast or do you want
Oh, no.
to try to have coffee? And it's like watching a transit happen before my eyes. Like, oh, this is the moment where I make the decision to either have nothing, which feels like a Moon Mars situation, or put caffeine in my stomach, which is also a Moon Mars situation. And there's no other choices, really. I think
Ooh.
that's it. So that's part of what I'm learning about transits through that experience. Something
Yeah.
inevitably messes with it no matter how comfortable or careful you
Oh,
are.
yeah. Oh my gosh, wow. Oh, Sarah, you had also made a note, and I thought this was really interesting, that these tragic, fires in LA, started under this Mars retrograde, which began in Leo as it's moving back into Cancer, and you correlated that to another event, another retrograde event in Leo, and I'm curious if you wanna speak to that.
Yeah, and I haven't done a ton of really sitting down to work this out, but I think it's something that I'd be interested in doing at some point in the future. And that's about the Venus retrograde that happened in Leo. Was it 2 summers ago now that we had?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
2023.
Yeah. So I was thinking a lot about the strike, the writer strike,
Mhm.
and also the what I think it was Austin described it as like part of what happens with Venus and Leo is like bold displays of gender. So we had like the Barbie movie, and we had a lot of like female athletes coming into more prominence than we had had for a really long time. It was like a really and the Beyonce and Taylor Swift tours, but I really zeroed in on LA as, like, the site of Leo and retrograde, for strikes and the revisiting of, like, values and what's gonna matter in this community that's sort of like our celebrity, and we have talked about, for us as contemporary astrologers, often we think about Leo and rulership and sovereignty, and for us, celebrities are kind of like our
Mm,
rulers in a way because they're the most prominent figures we have. That part of what we've done is connect rulership with prominence, and I think that LA is like, a throne for us in the United
mhm.
States, and so
It's like a capital
I
city in a way.
yeah, I think so, and so, like a cultural capital for sure, right? And so
Right.
just thinking about Mars retrograding through this cultural capital with literally just with fucking fire,
Mhm.
and devastation to the community in another way, than the kind of revisiting and revising of how the city is going to run and what values it's going to run on. In this Mars retrograde, seems like it's more just like the destruction that it's vulnerable to as a result of
Mhm.
its history. So I'm
Mhm.
just thinking about that.
It makes me wonder how, because I know, folks in LA are going to resiliently rebuild. I mean, people have already, volunteered so much of their time, and just seeing such like amazing shows of compassion and humanity in LA. Um, what sort of fashion trends around like gender and gender expression, right? Since you mentioned bold displays of gender expression with Leo, um, and cultural norms that may emerge out of LA following these tragedies that might inform our culture for the next, in new ways for the next many years.
Yes. I had a less cool and fun thought from yours. I really like that one. I like that idea. I was thinking also about immigration and immigrant
Mm.
communities, especially with California, among other places, being targeted because of their sanctuary policies and history. Yeah, Mars and Cancer is one thing that Mars and Cancer is, for me, I think is turning out to be is like destruction in homes, like destruction in our domiciles, our places where we lay our heads. And that's happening through fire in LA, but it's also happening in raids that have already started. So
Mm.
raids of people's homes, workplaces, and removing the protections for things like schools, hospitals, and places of worship.
Yeah.
That those raids are already taking place, like being threatened to take place in those places and taking place in people's workplaces already. This feels like very Mars and Cancer to me.
Displacement is the word that keeps coming to mind, displacement of people from their homes, which also brings to mind Palestine. And we did have a ceasefire deal come through in Palestine. Um, I struggle to trust anything that any government says about deals, so I'm sort of watching that with bated breath. But people are celebrating; they are trying to return back to the homes from which they were displaced. Right? There's just a lot of themes of like rebuilding home, getting displaced from home, home being destroyed, home being invaded, home being surveilled. Right? Really, really big themes of that coming through this January.
Yeah, that's really true. I'm right with you on my lack of ability to trust what the ceasefire could actually mean, represent, and promise. That also feels like retrograde motion, where it's like, are we going back? Are we going forward? How much of this is real? I don't know. It is an interesting time. It's hard to enjoy. We locally in Houston with the snowstorm, since we had the terrible ice storm where we were without power and water for multiple days in 2021, I couldn't really enjoy just like a couple days of snow. Like we was
Mm.
very well organized. It was like we were encouraged to stay off the roads, and a lot of people who could stay home did. And there was a lot of, like, frolicking and happiness, and I just found myself not being able to, both because I was on call at the hospital, but also because of the stress that I'm still storing from going without electricity and water for multiple days in freezing temperatures, which Houston's not
Mhm.
built for. So, yeah, this, like, struggle to enjoy the things that are good because there's a backdrop of so much destruction.
Gosh, and doesn't that speak to Venus, in the sign of her exaltation, but, very, very close to Saturn and this sort of like all the pleasure, all the fun, all the like not worrying about things and just enjoying life because we're all one, which I think is the beauty of Venus in Pisces. Just really being like, yeah, there's a hard edge here that
Yeah.
we need to look out for. And um, so I think, yeah, it's a pretty mixed bag right now, and
Yeah.
to say the least, to say the
Yeah.
least. So, why don't we go ahead and transition to what's coming up in February? So, here is an overview. We tried to pick, what is it, like eight of the most important or kind of major moments in February. Um, and so we start the month off on February 4th with Venus moving into Aries. So this is important because this is the sign of Venus's exile, and where she will be doing her retrograde cycle here, starting in March, and March 1st, I believe. So she is going to get ready to station retrograde. And that same day, Jupiter stations direct. So we have both of our benefics in exile, right? So we'll speak to that. And then we have Neptune conjunct the North Node, February 6th. This is a transit that's only going to happen, what, about once every 20 years or so. So that's pretty important. Um, the Leo full moon is February 12th. We'll take a look at that chart and tell you what we see. Mercury moves into the sign of its fall, Pisces, but honestly, I love Mercury in Pisces. I think it's like such a wonderful, may not be the best transiting moment, but I think it's a really beautiful natal placement. I've loved many people with Mercury in Pisces. And that's February 14th, Valentine's Day. Um, and we'll be wrapping up Aquarius season a few days after that. The sun moves into Pisces. And then Mars stations direct February 23rd. And we'll be able to celebrate not having any inner planets retrograde for less than a week. But
Right.
we're celebrate.
Okay. Deal.
We're going to celebrate Mars direct in the sign of its fall. And I know it's kind of bleak, but when is February not? I mean, I'm sorry to say it's a tough month for me. New moon in Pisces closes out the month on February 27th. So, Sarah, if we are thinking about Venus in Aries, what does that call to mind, and what are you thinking about with kind of anticipating? And we'll say more about it before the March month ahead. But since the retrograde starts so early in March, what are you thinking about the retrograde cycle that's coming up with Venus and Aries?
Well, a couple things. My image for Venus and Aries is always that I think it was in People's Park in Berkeley where that woman put the flower in the gun. It
Yes.
was in like 1969. That's my Venus and Aries image, where it's like as a someone with Aries placements, apologies to all the Venusian folks, but I feel like it's just pointless. Like doing Venus things in Aries just feels like, oh my God, it's like really dreamy and silly. And also, like, thank God that someone, it takes courage to put a flower in the barrel of a gun,
Mm-hmm.
even if
It
it's
sure does.
maybe not accomplishing anything. So that's one thing I think. Um,
Only an image that's burned into our mind for the rest of time.
yeah, but it's an image of detriment to me.
Yeah, it
So
is. It is. It is an image of detriment. Yeah. Um, I have a good friend who has Venus and Aries natally, and he loves taking photos of garbage. I just think that that's
yeah,
such an
exactly.
amazing, like really beautiful, poignant, interesting, provocative, funny photos of fucking trash, right?
Mhm.
And that is, yeah, it's like how, how do we attempt to make a hot dumpster fire beautiful? How do we find beauty in that? How do we find connection in that, right?
Mhm.
I saw a meme recently that was like, I don't know, it was like the way that we're getting through this is that our inner dumpster fire is going to burn hotter than the outer dumpster fire, right?
Yeah, I think it's the person who's in the middle of a fight who says, "I just love you so much, and we can keep fighting, but I just want you to know I really love you." Like, it is important, like, to have that inbreaking, and also, it it it's disorienting.
Yeah.
So thank
Yeah.
God for it, and it's disorienting, I think.
Yeah. And, you know, this Venus retrograde in Aries that we're coming into happens every 8 years. And so the last time this happened was in early 2017. And preceding that, we had the Women's March in DC. And that year, we also had the Me Too movement. So there's a lot of like women, femmes, queers fighting back, I think, or taking a stance. I really associate Aries with the ecosystem of autonomy and And so Venus moving in there, who is really more of a planet of cooperation and
Yeah.
relationship, moving into this sign of autonomy and saying like, "Okay, look, like, in order to be in relationship, we need to have autonomy." Um, so, yeah, I think that themes of autonomy are going to be really present, and, I mean, it's just so obvious already what, I think much of what's going to come up right around women's rights, around the right to choose, access to, contraception, things like that, and then also just cultural attitudes around women. And then we're already seeing the official policy of the U.S. government is now that there are two sexes and they correlate one to one to two genders, and you may not change your gender. You just are what you were assigned at birth. Of course, this leaves out all sorts of actual science, but then also just like the realities of queer people, trans people, non-binary people around gender expression, gender identity, and how that relates to one's healthcare. I mean, they've
Mhm.
frozen all applications to the State Department for passports that have X markers on them for gender, which is terrifying that now they have documentation of the people who identify differently. So I think that, the writing's kind of on the wall about what this Venus into Aries, and the retrograde cycle is going to be about. But,
I think
there's always room for surprise.
yeah, and if January is any indication, I think we are probably in for some surprise. Like, there's a way
Yeah.
that this will make even more sense to us as it unfolds. A couple of things I want to add to what you're saying. One is that this transit connects directly to a retrograding Mars in its fall. So that's the condition of Aries as Venus enters it, which is also
Mhm.
interesting, right? And so it feels like under really terrible conditions, our our benefic Venus is going to be doing everything that they can,
Hmm.
and that feels like the reality that we are living in and
Mhm.
is becoming increasingly apparent. And what was the other thing? Oh, the other thing that I was thinking about was that we've left the nodal cycle of Aries Libra. And so I'm thinking about the eclipses that happened in Aries, particularly the solar eclipses in Aries,
And
and
we have one
all of the
more.
intensity. Yeah, all of the intensity that that brought. And so just thinking about what a benefic can do in detriment in the places where we have had things like major beginnings and endings, personally and collectively.
Yeah. It's Aries, if we were to pick a sign that is the biggest shitstorm of the zodiac right now, I think it's Aries, and it will continue to be that way. So, um, mercy, mercy, on our folks with Aries placements and just on all of us, 'cause, we all got it in there in the chart, so,
Mm.
um, okay, so February 4th, that same day that Venus moves into Aries, Jupiter stations direct. And so this is the last station for Jupiter in the sign of Gemini, and he will be swiftly moving now toward the sign of Cancer, toward exaltation. And so if there have been delays, stagnations, big questions in Gemini area of your chart or in the Pisces and Sagittarius areas of the chart, that might be something to look for around February 4th. Um, but also, I think this one of the things that we've looked at over the last year with Jupiter and Gemini since last May is this sort of multiplicity of realities, multiplicity of truths, multiplicity of perspectives that kind of like don't match. they don't they don't add, it
Right.
doesn't add up. And so I think confusion and chaos are two words that are great for Jupiter and Gemini. And um, so I don't know, what the direct station is necessarily going to bring. But maybe, I mean, always kind of a sense of forward momentum around like whatever the retrograde was concerned with. So I mean, the election was, happened
Mhm.
under this Jupiter retrograde in a big way. So, yeah, it's kind of like, all right, we're moving forward with the chaos now. Like, yeah.
It's kinda scary to think about a detriment of Jupiter, stationing in direct again for the last time, but almost 2 whole decades worth of time. Watching the government in a flurry of activity, just so many things happening at once that you can't even really keep track, and the numbing, kind of desensitizing that comes from, like, finding out another thing and another thing and another thing that have happened during especially during this, like, stationing time. Yeah, it's a little bit scary to me, like, what this last direct sweep of Jupiter and Gemini will be for us who are based in the United States, um, until June, when Jupiter goes into Cancer, and supposedly, that's gonna be amazing, right? Because of a totally different condition of Jupiter. It'll be interesting if Jupiter
Yeah.
we talk about, like, Jupiter representing our leaders and laws and things like that. Like, what could that transition even look like if we're tracking Jupiter and Gemini correctly as about this kind of, like, confusing, chaos machine? What will
Mhm.
Jupiter Cancer in June look like? It'll be interesting to find out.
Yeah, I think, we can talk about that another time, I guess. But it's, I don't wanna, like, overpromise and underdeliver on Jupiter and Cancer. I think that there will be some really beautiful, maybe on, like, personal level kinda stuff,
Yeah.
but I think that, like, nationalism and jingoism are gonna be really, really strong, associations with that because,
Mhm.
Cancer is that sign of the homeland, of the clan, of who's in, who's out, that's, like,
Mm,
kind of the shadow side of Cancer. I say this
mm,
as a Cancer sun. Who's family, who's not. And the United States is also a Cancer sun. So, we shall see. I think it's going to be a tale of 2 Americas. I
yeah,
think that's kind of what this
absolutely.
Jupiter and Gemini is, and the direct motion is like, "Okay, we've undone all this shit, and now we're gonna move forward with all the undoing," right? And the new doings, which are, as important as the undoings. So, um moving right along, Neptune conjunct the North Node on February 6th. The North Node amplifies and increases whatever it touches, right? Whatever and it can be in a kind of chaotic way. So for me, I associate Neptune with think the more maybe like positive associations are like transcendence, spirituality, right? Um, and maybe the shadow side might be like dissociation, delusion, you know, um, altered states like using intoxicants or things like that, and in a good or a bad way, right? So yeah, would you have anything to add to that?
Um, it looked like if Venus and Aries and Jupiter and Gemini look like good things that don't have everything they need to do it, like out of reach, like good things wanting to do good things, but feeling out of reach. Neptune in the North Node just looks like not knowing, like not knowing where to put energy, like that kind of feeling taking over. But what I like about what you're saying is perhaps it will be a burst of imagination.
Mhm.
Perhaps it will be like an imagining of something bigger, better, lovelier, like a hunger to imagine something that we can't even comprehend yet in the face of everything else we're facing. I mean, maybe that's a positive possibility.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. So I think approach with caution. I think this is a powerful conjunction. And I would be like really careful, especially about getting into situations where if the boundaries aren't clear, it
Yeah,
could be
I
dangerous.
totally agree.
Or like using intoxicants
Yep.
around this time could be potentially really chaotic. So I think, yeah, if you can use this time for like curiosity, fantasy, imagination, right? Like we do a Lord of the Rings marathon,
Yeah. Yeah, art, I think about, like, doing art in a
escapism.
museum. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
A
we might all
whole
need a
day of
healthy
the arts.
escape. Uh,
Yeah, like, maybe you watch all of the Oscar-nominated movies you haven't seen yet. You just,
oh,
like,
I
take the time
love
and you just
that.
dive into it, but maybe sober and maybe don't drive, like,
Yeah.
just careful,
Yeah.
sober fantasy.
Yeah, yes,
Sound like
yes.
grandmas, I
Mind
think.
mind the deluge, right? Mind the flooding. We wanna be, like, really careful. Um, let's take a look at the full moon of February 12th here. I'm gonna share that chart. So this is the full moon in Leo, and it is at 24 degrees and 6 minutes of Leo, um, opposite the sun in Aquarius, and the sun is conjunct Mercury in Aquarius. Sarah, I'm wondering what else you notice about this chart in particular.
It's square Uranus by 1 degree, so
Oh,
I picture unforeseen, kind of blaring, unforeseen things, around
yeah,
this.
yeah,
Here's Uranus and Taurus, has made it to 23 degrees, which is
yeah.
it's not like I'm longing to be done necessarily because Uranus and Gemini is a whole other thing, but it just feels like, ooh, we keep getting these, like, major transit squares to Uranus, and it always brings, an upset, a disruption, an upending, and I
Mhm.
just have to anticipate the same for this
Yeah,
formation.
yeah. I mean, I I tend to have a cautious view of Uranus, but at this moment in time, like, knowing that Uranus was, like, discovered and identified as a planet at around the time of the American and French revolutions,
Mhm.
um, gives me some hope because I think, again, that word autonomy, like, Uranus is like, I'm going to upend the status quo. And, in some ways, we're having the status quo upended in ways that are really frightening right now. But I think that what is giving me hope is that people are really getting involved in securing their own autonomy, and on a collective level. So um, I think that, yeah, this kinda T-square between the sun and the moon and Uranus in the fixed signs, um, is really interesting, because it does to me signal, yeah, major changes in things that we kind of take for granted as fixed, as guaranteed,
Mhm.
right? In technology, in, rulership and sovereignty and creativity, right? And then also in the things that sustain us and in food and, comfort. So yeah, interesting full moon. I think that February is really going to be a lot of kind of responding to January and preparing for all of the like just wild nature of the astrology
Mhm.
of March for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
And I didn't really notice. I mean, Neptune and the North Node are still, like, within a degree too. So that
mm,
will maybe feel some of that, or it'll still be with us. Whatever that was will still be kind of there at
yeah,
running parallel to
yeah.
us.
A lot of stuff going on in late Pisces for sure. So why don't we talk briefly about Mercury into Pisces, the Sun into Pisces, February 14th, 18th. These are annual transits. They're not super unusual. But we are moving into this sign that is really concerned, I think, with love. It's the only sign where it's domiciled ruler and exaltation ruler are both of the benefics, right?
Mm.
So there is a goodness and a sweetness to Pisces that I think is important to name. And I think Pisces is a sign that is really concerned with connection, which is like such a fundamental human need, right? Connection beyond boundaries. And so um, what does it look like to be connected to one another, I think are questions that I have in mind as Mercury and the Sun move into Pisces. And Sarah, I'm wondering if there's anything else that you're thinking of around those dates in mid-February.
Mm, Saturn's still there, so I think there's an austerity that I don't always think of as like what's happening with Pisces. That while Saturn is in Pisces, I just continue to feel anything that's happening in Pisces has an austerity to it that it otherwise maybe wouldn't.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think of Mercury and Pisces as like the placement that is thinking and feeling a lot, but might just not say anything. It just might
Mhm.
withhold because of how much is going on complexly inside on the other side of that boundary. So I wonder
Yeah.
the sun, uh, the sun moving into Pisces. I don't know. I don't know what I think about that. I mean, I think the co-presence with Pluto, like this Sun Pluto conjunction that we've just come through in January, um, the sun in Aquarius is always kind of rough. Like the sun doesn't want to be in Aquarius, and so it's just a rough time. So sometimes
Mhm.
Pisces feels like the promise of spring. But I
Mhm.
don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree that Saturn there has given a somberness to Pisces, right? And it's manifested for me in like um kind of complete like reevaluation and restructuring of how I actually tap into my compassion and how I
Mhm.
actually tap into that like boundless love in a time where I am so angry, right? So angry and so scared, of what's happening. And so, yeah, I think, and that maybe will come up, in our scripture and spiritual grounding that we'll talk about next. And I think that we can also connect that to the new moon in Pisces that happens on February 27th.
Mhm.
Um, and before we get there, I just want to mention again that Mars stations direct on February 23rd, which I hope does look like some sort of relief or some sort of moving forward with a new strategy. I can certainly see how that's playing out in my own life. Um, Moving forward with new strategies around these topics of home displacement, belonging, intrusion, surveillance, right? All these things that we've kind of been seeing with Mars retrograde.
Yeah, I think the direct turn of a long retrograde cycle like this one, for me, I tend to notice that's when you can start to see what the story of the retrograde has been and what you want to do with it, and including
Yeah.
nothing. But I mean, that's always a choice that we have. But I think it's when it turns direct that we start to sort of see that, like, oh, this is what
Yeah.
that story was.
Yeah, totally. So, when Sarah and I were preparing for today and thinking about all of this Piscean stuff,
Mm.
and the sort of overwhelm and the deluge and getting swamped, that is happening right now, that is also surely a political tactic being used against the populace right now. We thought to turn to Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. Disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? You still have no faith." They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. So, Sarah, I'm wondering if you have any initial thoughts on this passage and how it might speak to our spiritual grounding in this moment that we've named as being confusing, chaotic, overwhelming, scary, enraging.
Verse 37 especially feels like it captures a lot of things that we're talking about right now. The furious squall feels like Jupiter and Gemini and maybe even a retrograding Mars. here Mars is in Cancer, and so I'm also thinking about the waves feel destructive, like the ocean
Mhm.
feels like a place of harm.
Malefics in
And
the water signs, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so I think the thing that I'm kind of thinking about is being someone who feels like the water feels nearly swamped. It's starting to feel like that. So, and I think the transits of February will continue to heighten that feeling. So, what does it mean to have an ally and someone who doesn't feel swamped in that situation? Where might some of those alliances come that are strengthening? It's disorienting even to have good news or experience something salvific in the midst of feeling like you might drown. It's still kind of disorienting because it's like, okay, so someone's in charge of this, but not me. And how am I supposed to be in relationship with this kind of disorienting control that this one figure has? So I'm kind of
Mhm.
sitting with.
I love that, thank you, yeah. I think that the first verse really, like, signals to me, let us go over to the other side," signals to me, like, transition, right? We're going from one reality to the next, and in the middle is this, like, watery transition space,
Mhm.
and transition is often really, really scary because we're not quite where we're going, and we're also not where we've been, and there's no going back, and I think that that is where we are historically and astrologically right now. So that really speaks to that with me. Um, and also this makes me think of like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves about what's happening, right? Like Jesus isn't concerned they're drowning. It might drown, clearly. He's sleeping in the back of the boat, right? And so I can see the disciples freaking out, and I can imagine my own inner parts that are really freaking out right now and are like, "Oh, we're all gonna die," like, "They're gonna kill it." This just sort of panic. Um, and, so yeah, really taking a moment to become present with, like, what is actually happening? What is within my control to do about the situation? I mean, it's very, like, serenity prayer, right? Um, what are the stories I'm telling myself about what's happening? Because that is a huge factor in my own panic and anger. And how can I rely on the tenets of my faith and on my love, my relationships, my honesty, my integrity, right? To, all these things that Jesus represents, right? To calm the panic, which to me is like this allegory, calming the wind, calming the waves. Um, and finding that stillness inside to carry through this moment of really big transition. Because I do think we fill in the gaps when we don't know what's going on, and we often fill them in with really, really terrifying stories. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your time. And thanks to all who have tuned in. We will be back in just a few weeks since February is a short month.
Mm.
Um, and Sarah and I are going to be offering our Lenten lunar series. So stay tuned for more information on that on my website, badpastor.me. If you haven't signed up for my email, you can do that on the website as well. I will definitely be emailing about it. And this is going to be a 7-week series over Lent where we are going to learn how to be in connection with the moon. And I think that that really speaks to what we were just talking about too, is like, what are the reliable things that we can lean on right now? And the moon is always there and always in relationship with us, whether we know it or not. So I'm thinking of this series as cultivating a relationship with the moon over Lent. And Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add to that or anything else that we need to let people know about?
No, thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. All right, everyone, take good care and we will see you soon.